This is Ataturk's Hat Law. It was enforced on the 25th of November 1925, which banned the use of Islamic headwear and forced the use of Western hats on all public and civil servants in Turkey. Otherwise known as the Hat Revolution, it was one example of how Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the first president of Turkey, radically changed Turkish society to copy a Western secular model. All of this, according to Ataturk, was to advance the Turkish peoples to the likes of Western civilization, especially after decades of social and economic turmoil. And since Ataturk had traveled across Europe, he emphasized that Turkey must not only remove Islam from law and politics, but also from the public domain. This is what motivated Ataturk to enforce the Hat Revolution, believing that it was another step to progress and ultimately Western civilization for the Turkish nation. However, this radical reform stripped the religious expression of many Muslims, something which is ironically allowed in Western countries today. And since the Turkish Criminal Code stated that disagreeing with Ataturk's policies were, quote, being opposed to the command of officials maintaining public order and safety, any form of opposition to the Hat Law was punished. For instance, in the city of Erzurum, arrests were made against Muslims who petitioned to keep their traditional winter hat rather than the newly imposed Western hats. When an additional 3,000 Muslims gathered in protest across the city, for unknown reasons, the police fired on them, which killed up to 32 demonstrators. Similar protests were also made in the cities of Kayseri and Maraş, which also led to mass arrests. In Rize, meanwhile, the situation got violent as some 1,000 Muslim insurgents revolted and overran the entire district against the Hat Law. And according to the British consulate in Turkey, it escalated to the point where the Turkish cruiser Hamidi was sent and bombarded the rioters into submission. By the end of 1925, when all of the unrest ended, Turkey organized military tribunals to punish anyone who publicly opposed the Hat Law. In particular, the death penalty was handed freely to Muslims ranging from critics of the law to those who demonstrated on the streets. There were even situations where defendants, who were illiterate and could not defend themselves, were sentenced to death. In total, at least 57 people were executed and hundreds more were imprisoned. And although the Hat Law has recently been abolished, this is one of Ataturk's radical policies which westernized Turkish society. More importantly, it stripped Muslims of their ability to freely practice their faith, including what they are allowed to wear. And unfortunately, this attitude towards Islam in Turkey continued until Ataturk's death in 1938, and we can see the ramifications to this day. What you have just listened to was the Adhan, otherwise known as the Islamic call to prayer. But for the Muslims watching, it sounds unfamiliar, and that is because the Adhan is supposed to be recited in Arabic, which has been the case since the Muslims of the 7th century, and the language itself was specifically picked by Allah to help the Prophet Muhammad to spread Islam to his people. But Arabic was not chosen out of racial superiority, which is something that the Prophet Muhammad made very clear. Instead, Arabic being used in all Islamic customs, including the Adhan, has been crucial for uniting all Muslims, regardless of race, into worshipping the oneness of Allah. However, this was not the vision for the founders of the Turkish Republic, who had an alternative view of the Muslim-majority Turkish society. They were influenced by the rise of nationalism across Europe and how it meddled into Christianity. More specifically, how the Bible was translated into different languages, while Latin was becoming abandoned by non-Catholics for their own native tongues. And since the Ottoman Empire was declining while Europe flourished, Turkish nationalists believed that by combating Islam, or at least reforming it, it was necessary to replicate the West. And this idea of nationalism becoming the new guiding ideology of the world led to suggestions of Turkifying the Quran, Turkifying Islamic prayers and sermons, and even the Adhan. All of this influenced Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the first president of Turkey, to radically change Islamic practices through the eyes of Turkish nationalism. And that is why for 18 years, the original Arabic Adhan was banned in Turkey, and those that did not comply were punished. And what you just heard before was the Turkish alternative to the Adhan, something which caused unnecessary harm to the Muslims of Turkey who simply wanted to practice and worship Allah without the constraints and meddling of the nationalist Turkish government. This all began in 1928 when the Ottoman Arabic script was abandoned for a Latin one, and this was all substantial to Turkish society because it purged many words that had been used for over 1,000 years, especially ones from Arabic or Persian origins. And mind you, this was all achieved in a matter of 6 months. This not only pushed the Turkish public further away from Arabic, but it also allowed the Ataturk to then target Islamic customs, including the Adhan. So by 1931, all except for one word in the entire Arabic Adhan was changed. It went to the point where any mentions of Allah were removed for the word Tanrı, where in some Turkic languages, references to the sky god Tenri, once worshipped by ancient Turks. For this Turkish Adhan to become popular, it was then introduced during the Islamic month of Ramadan in the year of 1932. Across famous mosques, Arabic became used less and less while Turkish was increasingly used in not only Adhans but also for reciting the Quran and Islamic sermons. And by 1932, the Turkish government decided that the Turkish Adhan was now compulsory across the country. Through the Department of Religious Affairs, otherwise known as the Diyanet, they stationed police officers outside of mosques to punish anyone that did not comply. But there was some opposition to these laws, including instances where imams would get children and mentally ill people to recite the Turkish Adhan as an insult to the government. Yet more backlash came in February of 1933 when a Muslim was severely beaten up by plainclothes police officers in the city of Bursa because he recited the Adhan in Arabic. And this led to protests against the Turkish Adhan, which was then suppressed by the military pouring into the city. Following the event, Turkish newspapers insulted the demonstrations, while Ataturk personally bashed them as ignorant and narrow-minded people. Fines were also placed on the Arabic Adhan following Ataturk's death in 1941, further punishing those who went against the Turkish Adhan. And it was only until 1950 when the Arabic Adhan was then legalized under the first democratically elected president Adnan Menderes. And this is where I want to mention something. Even though the Turkish Adhan was eventually abandoned, Ataturk's legacy still affects how Turks practice Islam today. And this is because Ataturk knew that he could not simply remove Islam from Turkish society. And that was because for hundreds of years, Islam was Turkish culture, was Turkish history, and most importantly, Turkish people. So what Ataturk did instead was to blend Turkish nationalism, something that he personally believed in, with Islam. Remember Diyanet, the organization that I mentioned earlier in this video? It's interesting that they were formed on the exact same day that the Caliphate was abolished, the once spiritual and political head of Islam. It was as if Ataturk simply molded Islam into something else. And as someone who comes from the Turkish diaspora, I have noticed the differences between the mosques sponsored by Diyanet to other communities, the Turkish poems they add in the funeral services, the portraits of Ataturk, or even how Turkish imams get constantly shifted around under the orders of the organization. So while the Turkish Adhan only lasted for 18 years, Turkish Islam has continued to this day as a form of control in how Turks practice their faith. It may not be as cruel as Ataturk, but the Turkish government still meddles into Islamic customs with some elements of secularism and Turkish nationalism. But when Adnan Menderes returned the Arabic Adhan to Turkey in 1950, I think he summed up how Islam should be treated best. I know I'm reacting to an old video, and a lot has happened in the past few years, but Vox is still wrong about Turkey. If you don't know, Vox is a news company that is known to promote left-leaning content on their channel, and this has influenced how they represent Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the first president of Turkey, compared to Erdogan, who is the current leader of the country. While one is portrayed as the founding father of a Western secular democracy, one that provided progress for the Turkish people, the other is depicted as an evil turn towards Islamism and authoritarianism. But not only Vox is wrong about any of these depictions, but both leaders are more similar than you think. Mainly because Turkey was founded by the guiding principles of secularism and Turkish nationalism, which was embedded into the Turkish state and society for decades. And while Erdogan has made some changes, which I will give credit to him, it's the institutions that form the core of the Turkish government which are still here and continue to control how Islam is practiced today. All of this is why we should never romanticize our leaders, because this not only forms a cult of personality around inherently flawed people, but we then believe that they are immune to criticism. This includes both Ataturk and Erdogan, and Fox is simply incompetent to even comprehend this very fact. So, yeah, let's get started, shall we?
Ataturk was a military general who created the Republic of Turkey out of the collapsed Ottoman Empire in 1923. During his 15 years in office, he enjoyed similar powers now held by Erdogan. He used them to build Turkey into a modern and secular state.
Turkey's new government separates church and state.
Now, when they say that Ataturk separated church and state, they mean laicite. This is also known as French secularism, and its policies not only remove religion from politics, but also from the public. This is different from most countries, as even in Australia, where I'm from, religion is only removed from politics, and secularism does not apply to the public, where Australians can freely practice their faith with little government intervention. But Ataturk's secularism was extreme compared to most Western countries because he actually wanted to change how Islam was practiced in Turkey, including its rituals and customs. This is not only important for the video, but Ataturk's radical policies led to many violent events in Turkish history, most of which are forgotten today. And again, Vox does not make this distinction, and they mislead their audience into believing that Ataturk's secularism is something similar to the West, which it isn't, and that has to be made clear.
So he banned head coverings.
To Kemal, this headgear, the fez, symbolizes Turkey's oriental fatalism and ignorance. He will abolish it.
I have already made a video on this, and I recommend you to check it out. But basically, Ataturk believed that if Turkish society would adopt Western clothing, it would be symbolic of them going towards modernization and ultimately Western civilization. However, the way Ataturk enforced it was not consensual at all. Instead, all public and civil servants were actually banned from wearing Islamic clothing from 1925 and onwards. And this outraged many people, leading to protests, dozens executed, and hundreds more imprisoned by the state. The point is that how Ataturk imposed these reforms was authoritarian and disregarded whether the people would accept it or not. And this is something that Vox is going to ignore throughout this video and then chastise Erdogan for his authoritarian policies, even though they're sort of similar to what Ataturk did as well.
He put mosques under state control.
Islamic traditions are shattered.
He made it basically illegal to discriminate against women.
He takes pleasure in the company of emancipated women.
This is something I'm going to comment on later, but all I will say is that Ataturk had greater leniency towards women when it comes to his reforms. Unlike the ban on Islamic clothing for men, something which I just talked about before, women were one of the few groups in Turkey which actually benefited from the Ataturk regime. However, his secular attitudes towards Islamic clothing and women did set the precedent for Kemalist governments in the future to later repress Muslim women, especially on what they could and couldn't wear in public. But this will be discussed later in this video.
Ataturk also industrialized his country. Under his watch, the industrial sector saw a sharp increase, and his liberal foreign policies built a close relationship with the West, which paved the way for Turkey to join the NATO alliance in 1952.
We know that Ataturk succeeded because for decades it was a modern, secular Western country like he wanted it to be.
Turkey may be on paper a quote Western secular democracy, but historically that has not been true. I'm going to repeat this throughout this video, that Turkey was only a democracy for the people who aligned with Ataturk's vision. If you tolerated a homogeneous Turkish identity, accepted state secularism, and embraced Western values, Turkey truly benefited you. And that is why many secular Turks adore Ataturk as someone who gave them a secular democratic state. However, democracy was only to those that assimilated into this secular and Turkish identity. This is important because Turkey contained many groups that did not align with Ataturk's nationalist vision, including religious Muslims and ethnic minorities, and forcing assimilation by the state, especially to those with distinct customs and cultures practiced for over 1,000 years. Resentment towards the government grew. It led to many instances of violence and brutality from the Ataturk regime, many which are also forgotten by the West. And even though Turkish democracy actually began in 1950, any sort of deviation from Kemalism was severely punished. And now Vox is going to reveal how democratic Turkey really was after Ataturk.
But how does a religious, conservative leader acquire so much power in a secular country? To understand this, you have to know what happened to Turkey after Ataturk's death. For 5 decades, the country was constantly in a state of upheaval. Ataturk had given the military the responsibility of keeping Turkey secular, and they did so by staging coups in 1960, 71, 80, and again in 1997. While the interventions were meant to keep Turkey democratic, the instability left the country in poor shape.
So now we have the context of how Turkey has remained a quote-unquote Western secular democracy. Let me ask you something. If a shadowy military force is the one that controls the democracy, is Turkey really a democracy? Vox is right about the instability of Turkey during the Cold War, but that doesn't explain how the Turkish military staging coups against democratically elected politicians, mind you, is democratic at all. It's just an excuse to brush off how, for decades, the military has swooped into power and oppressed the Turkish people even more at times. And again, my issue with Vox is that they tolerate one form of authoritarianism and not the other. Erdogan, the democratically elected president of Turkey, is bashed by Vox as a brutal ruler. And you can make that claim, but you can't just turn around and say that Ataturk achieved a Western secular democracy, even though his party ruled alone for 27 years, and then when Turkey actually became a democracy, it was still in the hands of the Turkish military until very recently, with 4 coups happening in the past 60 years. I'm just baffled that Vox praises the Turkish military as some arbiter of democracy, despite the bloody history associated with them.
Enter Recep Tayyip Erdogan. He was the mayor of Istanbul from 1994 to 97. 2 years later, he was arrested for a public reading of a politically charged Islamic poem by a Turkish nationalist.
So before we continue, I need to focus on this guy, Ziya Gökalp. He was a Turkish sociologist during the final decades of the Ottoman Empire, and Vox here paints him as someone who appeals to Erdogan and therefore Islamism. And while Gökalp does reference Islam a lot in his works, he is, in the end of the day, a Turkish nationalist. He actually despises how Islam was something that united the Ottoman Empire at the time, and instead he believed that not only Islam, but also non-Turkish minorities in the empire should undergo the process of Turkification, if you can call it that. So basically, cultural assimilation. And to understand why this is important, his attitude shared among other Ottoman politicians is what led to the Armenian genocide in World War I. And do you know who else Gökalp inspired? Ataturk. And you can see this in how nationalism is at the core of Turkish society. And during the 1920s and 30s, everyone had to adopt to a homogeneous Turkish identity. This was responsible for huge ramifications against non-Turkish minorities in the country, all because of Ataturk's nationalist beliefs. Even groups like the PKK, which dominate the news today, exist mainly because of how Ataturk treated the Kurds and the suppression of their culture during the 20s and 30s. Again, the reason why I'm even talking about Ziya Gökalp is firstly, Vox doesn't even know who they're talking about. But secondly, it shows how Gökalp inspired not only Ataturk, but Erdogan. You can see this from the Turkish flags which dominate the public view to even the entertainment scene. Nationalism is at the forefront of Turkish society, which again debunks Vox's argument that both these leaders are completely inseparable, because at the end of the day, Erdogan has continued using nationalism across all aspects of Turkish society.
Erdogan began removing Ataturk's secular laws more aggressively. He ended the ban on wearing headscarves.
I'm going to be honest with you. This is probably the worst part of the video because Vox is suggesting that banning the headscarf is some aggressive step away from secularism, as if that's something bad for the country. But if Vox is not going to give you the dark history, I will. While Ataturk never imposed a hijab ban, he did encourage women to wear Western clothes. And this sort of attitude was actually enforced after the Turkish coup in 1980 when headscarves was banned from being worn in schools, public buildings and universities out of the names of secularism or whatever. Those that wore hijabs at the time were kicked out of these institutions while others were arrested for protesting against the law. There was even a Turkish politician who was kicked out of parliament simply because she wore a hijab, and I wonder what her colleagues said to her.
Burası devlete meydan okunacak yer değildir. Lütfen bu hanıma haddini bildiriniz.
Mind you, Vox just said in the same video that Ataturk made it, quote, illegal to discriminate against women. But that wasn't the case for more religious women who, for decades, were oppressed by the Turkish government for daring to wear a headscarf in public buildings. And I know what happened in the 1930s is different to what happened in the 1980s, and Ataturk didn't really enforce what women should and shouldn't wear, but it was his ideology that carried on into the 80s by the military dictatorship that actually made it into the law. And I just find it disgusting for Vox to suggest that Erdogan even getting rid of this draconian law was aggressive. Again, they're being hypocritical to praise Ataturk for his treatment of women, but not Erdogan, who actually provided democratic rights for many women in Turkey by actually getting rid of the hijab ban law in 2014.
Tightened restrictions on alcohol sales, and freed mosques from government control.
Vox's talking point about Erdogan appealing to Islamists or something is the biggest misconception that the Western world has about Erdogan. And as I said at the beginning of this video, Turkey was founded and continues to revolve around laicite, which, as I said before, was French secularism. Not the separation of church and state, but the control of religion. There is a difference, and Erdogan does influence how Islam is practiced through the Diyanet, which is Turkey's Department of Religious Affairs. It was actually founded on the exact same day when the Caliphate was abolished, which was Islam's spiritual and political head since the 7th century. The point is that the institutions such as Diyanet were created for the sole purpose of molding Islam to whatever Ataturk desired it to be. In fact, he arguably created a separate sub-branch of the religion I like to call Turkish Islam, which reflects the country's nationalist and secular nature and how it embedded into the religion. What I'm trying to say, and getting back to the point, is that Erdogan still keeps these secular institutions that have historically controlled Islam in the country. Again, I come from the Turkish diaspora in Australia, and I have seen how Erdogan's government influences our mosques. For instance, out of the 6 Turkish mosques in Sydney, 5 are controlled by the Diyanet, and these mosques are far more regulated and politicized than other parts of the Muslim community, including the Islamic customs that they're allowed to practice. That's something that I have noticed when growing up around these Turkish mosques, and if you're more interested in this topic, I explore it in my previous video, link in the description. But this also applies to the other parts of the Turkish diaspora, don't get that mistaken, where there clearly is political influence in their mosques and Islamic institutions. I'm going to keep repeating this, but all aspects of Islam, regardless if it's in Turkey or in the diaspora abroad, are regulated and controlled by the state, just like how Ataturk did before his lifetime. So Vox's claim is bullshit.
And there were 2 groups of people who were terrified by this. One, the kind of secular Turks who looked back to Ataturk and said, the hell's happening to our country? The other was the military, and they were the ones, again, who believed that their core mission in life was to keep Turkey secular and that he was a threat.
When it comes to secular Turks, Vox is sort of right, especially those from the coastal regions of Turkey. Many despise Erdogan for his supposed turn to Islamism, but as I've discussed before, that's not really true. Not only that, but I also know close relatives of mine, the same people who adore Ataturk and defend him against any criticism, who then turn around and say that Erdogan is working in the best interests of Turkey. It's anecdotal, so take that for what you will, but I find it hard to believe that half of Turkey is supposed progressive and the other half are supposed hardcore Islamist. Unlike what Vox is claiming, Turkey is far more politically nuanced than other countries. The AK party is currently in a coalition with far-right nationalist parties, while there are even some Islamic parties that oppose Erdogan. The point is that supporters and opposition to Erdogan are very mixed, and again, Vox is just misleading you on that part. I also can't believe that Vox just said that the military is also against Erdogan. If you look at the 2016 coup attempt, which is what they talk about next, it was only supported by 10,000 soldiers and 1/3 of Turkey's military high command. But this number is dwarfed by the 500,000 personnel who remained loyal to Erdogan, which is largely why the coup eventually failed. For the first time in modern Turkish history, only a small minority of the military actually went against the government, and this suggests that most of the Turkish armed forces, the supposed bastions of secularism founded by Ataturk, actually supports Erdogan. Not only that, but the coup attempt was staged by Gülenists, an Islamic movement that actively works against Erdogan. So again, Vox misleads you to simply bash Erdogan while ignoring all of the political nuances when it comes to Turkish politics. So moving on, Vox then talks about the post-2016 purges in Turkey, but what I am going to finally touch on is Vox's final comment.
But I do think you're going to have the inevitable tension of a president who believes he's entitled to more power, taking more and more of it, and what remains a somewhat secular country that isn't comfortable with giving him that power. Do those tensions play out politically and in court, or do those play out in the streets? If it's actual fighting and violence, then what we know of as a democratic Turkey is over.
Now what Vox is saying here is actually right, but personally, as I've kind of outlined throughout this video, I'll be honest with you, Turkey hasn't really been a democracy throughout its history. It's not exclusive to Erdogan, but to most of modern Turkish history. It started with Ataturk, then to the military coups, and now Erdogan. And that's the point of me making this video. I'm just frustrated that Vox justifies one type of authoritarianism and not the other. Not only that, but they also whitewash the oppression faced under Ataturk. Even though his violent repression of opposition is important to understand why many conflicts are happening today. And if you want to know more, check out Gavin Lee Sprocket's article on collective action and the Turkish Republic. It's a good read, but again, what I'm trying to say is that Ataturk is not the benevolent leader that most people remember him today. And while he did some good, especially during the Turkish War of Independence, his legacy is overly romanticized, especially from those who benefited during Ataturk's regime, which shapes the history and the construction of Ataturk's legacy. Meanwhile, Erdogan still maintains the status quo of what Ataturk founded, a secular Turkish state, and again, Vox is not really talking about that at all and instead bashing him. I'm going to give Erdogan credit for the good changes that he did make, but he still appeals to Turkish nationalism while controlling Islam through the powers of the state, just like Ataturk. And this is why I despise Vox's video. If you're going to have bias, at least be honest with it. Yeah, they talked about some of the good that Erdogan did during, the 2000s, but most of the criticisms against him also apply to Ataturk, all of which they completely neglected, by the way. At the end of the day, Ataturk, Erdogan, any figure in human history should never be glorified. In doing so, we put these people into the position of being worshipped, believing that they are invincible to criticism or something. But unfortunately, Vox does the exact same thing in how they discuss Ataturk compared to Erdogan, and they misled you. So this video may come as a shock to much of my audience. Many of my previous videos have been dedicated to criticizing Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the first president of Turkey. While most Turks adore him, my videos are focused on the outright hatred he had towards Islam, his ultra-nationalist views and him repressing ethnic minorities, as well as his empowering of the Turkish military. Because of what he did from 1923 all the way to 1928, he is responsible for much of Turkey's suffering and chaos in the following decades, from military coups to oppressing innocent Muslims to even paving way for the PKK. These are genuine concerns and criticisms that people such as myself do and should hold. But resourcing all of Ataturk's actions down to him being supposedly Jewish is the most ahistorical and immature thing anyone could say. This claim has circulated in the past few decades but has made a comeback due to the internet. Because of it, many Muslims genuinely believe that only Ataturk hated Islam and did what he did to the Turkish people because he could have been Jewish. Conflating Ataturk's motivations and decisions, something which has changed Turkish history forever, into something having to do with Zionism, is disgusting. This is not a video defending Ataturk. You already know my position on the man. But this is not how you criticize someone as vile as Ataturk. Instead of criticizing his draconian laws against Islam, or his oppression of ethnic minorities, or even him controlling free speech, I had people come up to my face and say, I do not like Ataturk because he was Jewish. It boggles me. Accusations like this only make actual and genuine criticisms against Ataturk entirely pointless. I hope this video clarifies that Ataturk was not only Jewish but answer a fundamental question: why did he hate Islam in the first place? The accusation that Ataturk was Jewish can be split into two parts. This section will focus on suspicion surrounding the ethnicity of Ataturk's parents, especially his father, Ali Riza Effendi, whose background is still speculated by both historians and Muslims alike today. It also doesn't help that Ataturk was also born in the city of Salonika in modern-day Greece, which had a Jewish majority population at the time. Now, lots of people suggest that because of Salonika having such a big Jewish community, surely Ataturk must have been Jewish. On the surface, this actually makes sense, but when you look at the actual demographics of the city, that's not the case. While Jews numbered 47% of Salonika's population, they were not the overwhelming majority, with Turks being the second largest group at 22%, followed by Greeks, Bulgarians, and so on. Using this argument, there is no definite way of concluding that Ataturk was Jewish, especially since the city had a large Muslim population. Now, that doesn't address the ethnicity of Ataturk's parents, but that's also simple to explain. Even though people are theorizing that Ali Riza must have been Jewish, he was raised in the town of Kozazik, I can't pronounce that. Basically, it's a little town located in North Macedonia, and that is why accredited historians such as Andrew Mango, Lowell Giffau, and Ernest Jacquet all believe that Ataturk had some Slavic or Albanian ancestry. That also explains why he looks slightly different to ordinary Turks. And if you're still doubting this, other historians have pointed out that Kozazik is today populated by ethnic Turks, which make up the overwhelming majority of the town, meaning that Ataturk was also Turkish. So to summarize and to make it clear, most historians agree that Ataturk must have been a mix of Turkish, Slavic, or Albanian, and that is because nothing about Ataturk's parents suggests they were Jewish, and therefore Ataturk as well. This section of the video will debunk the second major argument calling Ataturk Jewish, and it has to do with the conspiracy theories surrounding the Dönme. To keep it brief, during the 1600s there was a Jewish rabbi who claimed to be the Jewish Messiah. But with the threat of being executed by the Sultan himself, the rabbi decided to convert to Islam, and many of his followers also converted but maintained their Jewish faith in private. So basically, they were crypto-Jews, or a more offensive way of calling them, Dönme, meaning apostate in Turkish. Because of this movement, many Muslims believe that Ataturk was not only a part of the Dönme, but conspired with Jews to oppress Islam during the 19s and 30s, and also conspired to build the State of Israel in the 1940s. Because if Ataturk hated Islam and repressed the faith that much, he surely must have been a Zionist, right? The problem with this argument is that the Dönme are over-exaggerated. In fact, Jews in the Ottoman Empire rarely supported Zionism, and that's because most of them were Sephardic Jews, who originated from Spain but fled to Ottoman lands after the Spanish Inquisition in the late 1400s. And within the Islamic world, whether it was North Africa or in the Ottoman Empire, they enjoyed such tolerance with their fellow Muslim brothers that they had no reason for them to support Zionism. In fact, Ottoman Jews were called the Loyal Millet for a reason, because despite the Ottomans collapsing on themselves during the Balkan Wars, World War I, and the Turkish War of Independence, they remained loyal to the Turkish people, and that is a testament to their unyielding support for their Muslim rulers. So accusing them of plotting for the destruction of the Caliphate alongside with Ataturk is a historical and disgusting. I don't understand why people pin all of the world's problems, especially in regards to the state of the Muslim world, on Jews, especially since some of the most vocal critics of Zionism are Jews themselves, and some of the biggest opponents to Islam throughout human history has nothing to do with Jewish people, from the Fir'aun to Abu Lahab to Ataturk just a century ago. The point is this: Jews in the Ottoman Empire had no reason to support Zionism, especially since they peacefully coincided with their fellow Muslims for hundreds if not thousands of years. And above all, I don't think Ataturk must have been Jewish to hate Islam. I think it comes from more fundamental things that shaped his childhood and experiences in the Ottoman Empire, all of it leading to the most radical change in Turkish history. For this final section of the video, I want to introduce my counter-argument, and I want to be blunt when I say that Ataturk arguably had an influence on Adolf Hitler. That may sound ridiculous to some in the audience, and I used to think so too, but mentioning the relationship between Hitler and Ataturk is important because it really shows that why calling Ataturk Jewish doesn't make sense. These two dictators are connected by the events of World War I. Both Germany and the Ottoman Empire sided with one another, but were also humiliated after the conflict, and while the former country spiraled down into political instability, the latter didn't. Instead, Ataturk led a nationalist resistance against the Allied occupiers, all of which led to the end of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of a new Turkish state. This determination really fascinated Hitler, and according to historian Stefan Ihrig in his book Ataturk and the Nazi Imagination, Hitler wanted to, quote, imitate Ataturk's radical construction of a new nation from the ashes of defeat in World War I. The point is that Hitler began to model the spread of Nazism in Germany based on Ataturk's nationalist revolution back at home, with many parallels you can see on the screen here. So if Ataturk was really Jewish, I don't think that Hitler, the guy that caused the Holocaust, will call Ataturk his, quote, star in the darkness. No, I am not kidding. And while Ataturk didn't personally like Hitler, his influence on Nazism even led to anti-Semitism rising in Turkey during the 1930s. It was actually Turkish newspapers, many of which were controlled by the Ataturk regime, which pumped out ruthless anti-Semitic messages on how Jews were not integrating into this new Turkish society and how they posed a security threat. All of this fueled a pogrom, yes, a pogrom, which made over 10,000 Jews flee the European parts of Turkey in 1934, all because of this constant harassment. My argument is that if Ataturk was really Jewish, then why did the pogrom happen in the first place? And so I don't piss off people in the comments. No, I do not think that Kemalism and Nazism are the same. They have fundamental differences between each other, but still, if Hitler had such a fascination with Ataturk in the first place, I don't think the guy could have been Jewish. I guess you understand why I made this video in the first place. Because I find it frustrating that people focus on the wrong things in history, and instead of looking at Ataturk's childhood, his education, his trips across Europe, or even his perspective of the Ottoman Empire collapsing, there are people who conclude that surely Ataturk must have been Jewish. To the people who still believe so, I don't think you're dumb. I just think you misplace your attention. Instead of focusing on dumb accusations such as this, focus on things that Ataturk actually did. Spread awareness on this unknown part of the past, because Ataturk has decisively changed the course of Islamic history forever, and in some ways, he is responsible for the disunity of the Muslim world, which is now divided more than ever, arguing over meaningless debates, and most tragic of them all, killing each other.
Hi everyone and welcome, this is the Apostate Prophet. Today I want to talk about the Turk who destroyed Islam. I'm not talking about myself, that would be very arrogant. I'm talking about Ataturk, a national hero to Turks. A few weeks ago I talked about what a caliphate is and the history of the Islamic Caliphate. And today I want to talk about the one man who destroyed the unity of Muslims and Islam forever. Oh, before I start,
Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. So today I'll be debunking a video that has honestly irritated me. I saw a couple years ago, and what hasn't left my mind is its complete misunderstanding of Turkish history, especially the relationship between the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Republic and Islam. More importantly, it just baffles me that someone is so capable to claim that they are neutral just to contradict themselves 2 seconds later, and to romanticize certain elements of history simply to smear Islam. This video in question, this channel in question, is Apostate Prophet, one of the biggest ex-Muslim and anti-Islamic platforms on the internet. And while Muslims have already debunked Apostate Prophet's claims over and over again, check out the playlist if you're interested below. No one has addressed any of these videos whenever it relates to Turkish history or politics. So that's going to be the topic of this video, and this is because many Muslims aren't aware that people are capable of weaponizing historical events or narratives to lie about Islam. People have done this with the Crusades, the Ottoman Empire, and most recently the European refugee crisis. However, this specific Apostate Prophet video that I will be responding to is the one titled "The Man Who Destroyed Islam." Look, before I even start the video, I need to address who Apostate Prophet is talking about. The man that appears on the thumbnail is none other than Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, and if you haven't seen my channel, I'm going to give you some quick context. He was the first and founding president of Turkey from 1923 to 1938, who was responsible for not only abolishing the Ottoman Empire, but more importantly the Caliphate, the once spiritual and political successor to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And Atatürk also secularized Turkish society heavily, making radical changes to how Islam was practiced in the country. With all of this in mind, Apostate Prophet argues that Atatürk abolishing the Caliphate 100 years ago is what destroyed the unity of the Muslim world forever. And to give him some credit, AP is technically right. The Caliphate prior to its abolishment was the universally accepted ruler of the Islamic world, and what Atatürk ended up doing divided it. More importantly, Atatürk also inspired many other Muslim countries to follow Turkey's model, that being a Western secular state. This is a very extensive topic and will be something I will touch on throughout this video. However, my biggest problem without even starting the video is a Prophet implying that Atatürk, quote, destroyed Islam. While I just said that the Muslim world is in a good state right now, it doesn't mean that Islam is dead, and the fact that Islam is going to be the world's largest religion by 2070 is a testament to this. This could have just been clickbait for the video, but regardless of the actions of one man, that being Atatürk, he has not changed the inevitable that Islam is going to be the dominant religion of the world in a matter of decades, and we're not even 1 second to the video, and yet Apostate Prophet has already fumbled.
Hi everyone and welcome, this is the Apostate Prophet. Today I want to talk about the Turk who destroyed Islam. I'm not talking about myself, that would be very arrogant. I'm talking about Ataturk, a national hero to Turks. A few weeks ago I talked about what a caliphate is and the history of the Islamic Caliphate. And today I want to talk about the one man who destroyed the unity of Muslims and Islam forever.
As I mentioned before, what Apostate Prophet says about the Caliphate is unfortunately true, because ever since the Caliphate, once the only authority that most Muslims rallied upon was abolished in 1924, the Islamic world has suffered from an existential crisis, not knowing what leader, country, or even ideology to follow. It's even something that we see to this day. And Kraut's video, The Turkish Century, explained this really well. While the same video has a lot of dodgy claims by Islam, so there's my warning for that, the overall message in the following clip is interesting to at least consider.
The caliphate had existed since Islam itself existed. The title had gone from the Umayyads to the Abbasids to the Ottomans and was seen as an integral part of the Islamic faith and the understanding of the Ummah as a community of Muslims in the world under a leader. And with one stroke of a pen, the presidential proclamation, Mustafa Kemal abolished it. Gone was a central element of the Islamic world, an authority to all Muslims and their understanding of themselves as a group identity and part of a community that had existed for over 1,000 years. The consequences of this decision were monumental. It completely shattered a key element in how many people in the Muslim world saw and understood themselves. What are we now? Who are we? What is our tribe? Our identity, our community? Are we still Muslims? Can Islam persist without the caliphate? Are we nationalities? Are we Asians? Are we Africans? Are we Arabs? Are we Iranian? Are we racist? Are we comrades? Are we a community? Can Jews or Christians be part of our community? Can we live with Hindus? Are we kings? Are we republicans? What? Where? Who? How? Many, if not most, of the problems throughout the Islamic countries in identity, politics, and nationality can be traced back to this fateful moment.
That being said, however, Apostate Prophet started the video still saying,
Today I want to talk about the Turk who destroyed Islam.
again, this is wrong. Yes, Turkey was and still is a Western secular state. Not only secularism enshrined in the Turkish constitution, but Ataturk's reforms to Islam were enforced through force, and those ripple effects are seen till this day. That's undeniable. However, it doesn't mean that Islam completely vanished from Turkish society, and ironically, many secular Turks, the same ones that sided with Ataturk, whether it was politicians or journalists at the time, repeatedly justified their reforms to Islam as something that ironically benefited Islam, even using Abu Hanifa, one of the biggest Islamic scholars in human history, to support their argument. This just goes to show that Islam, regardless of how people used it, was still important in Turkish society. It was a perverted version for sure, I'm not denying that, but Turks still worshipped Allah regardless, and the statistics show this. Not only that, but many of the reforms began with the Ottoman Empire decades ago, and Ataturk simply finished the job. Both the Ottomans in its final years and the Turkish Republic were largely identical for one another. This is something agreed upon by many historians. Honestly, this just shows that Apostate Prophet either didn't do his research or simply distorted history to leave an inaccurate impression on his ex-Muslim audience.
Some of you might know that I'm of Turkish origin, others might not even care. I don't blame you, I don't care either. For Turkish people, it is impossible not to know about Ataturk. Ataturk is the most important historical figure to most Turks. He's respected, loved, truly venerated. Statues of him are everywhere in Turkey. You see him when you go to school. You have dedicated holidays for him. In fact, on November 10th every year, at the time of the day he died, Turkey stands in silence for 1 minute in his honor. Personally, I've never been able to really relate to that, because I grew up in a religious family that didn't really care for the secular Ataturk. And probably also because I grew up in Germany, really adopting a German Western mindset. And in Germany, I learned not to idolize and deify a figure because, obviously, well, not just because of that, but with a German mindset, you just don't do that, right?
What Apostate Prophet mentioned here is interesting to say the least, because Ataturk is definitely one of the most glorified historical figures in human history. Like, I would say this full-heartedly. You don't see many people, for instance, hanging up portraits of Washington, Napoleon, etc., but you do see this with Ataturk, and even non-Muslims admit this.
I lived in Istanbul for a bit back in the mid-1990s, and even then, every house, shop, or restaurant had a photograph of Ataturk prominently displayed, to a degree that I personally have never seen of any other figure in any other country.
This is indeed true. However, Apostate Prophet, and this is my message to you if you even bother watching this, you do realize that you're doing the exact same thing that you preached against, you know, glorifying Ataturk.
Today I want to talk about the Turk who destroyed Islam. I understand why Turks idolize Ataturk so much though. Ataturk literally saved Turkey. But Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who was a very successful and influential commander in the Ottoman army, started a new movement against this defeat of the Ottoman Empire and the loss of independence.
Anyway, if you are watching this Apostate Prophet, I recommend you to read Gavin D. Brockett's Collective Action and the Turkish Revolution, where an actual historian will expose not only yourself, but also many Muslims watching my video, the common trap of deliberately or accidentally glorifying Ataturk. It is something that I will touch on later in this video.
I understand why Turks idolize Ataturk so much though. Ataturk literally saved Turkey. He saved it from being subdued and partitioned. The Ottoman Empire was allied to Germany and was part of the losing side in World War I. The Ottoman Empire, where the ruler was also the Caliph, the spiritual ruler over the Muslim world, accepted defeat in World War I and sat down with the Allies for negotiations. The Allies proposed that Ottoman Turkey should be hit very heavily. It would be financially limited, nearly entirely disarmed, internationally tried for war crimes, territories given to Greece, Armenia, and a possible Kurdistan, Istanbul taken and internationalized, and more. This was a very heavy payback for the aggressive history of the Ottoman Empire, the alliance with the German Empire, and war crimes and genocides that were said to have taken place.
Wait, what?
The Ottoman Empire, where the ruler was also the Caliph.
What Apostate Prophet just said, and I'm going to say this with 100% confidence, is like me saying that King Charles is the leader of the United Kingdom and not Rishi Sunak. That's going to sound baffling to a lot of people, and rightfully so, because by the time World War I started, the Ottoman Empire was a constitutional monarchy. The last Sultan, who actually had absolute authority, was Abdul Hamid II, who got deposed in 1909, 6 years prior to World War I. And instead, the new Sultan, Mehmed V, which was before Mehmed VI, which is the Sultan that Apostate Prophet's talking about. But anyway, Mehmed V was basically a figurehead of the new Ottoman government with little autonomy of his own. But wait, who was his new Ottoman government that I've been talking about? Well, it's the Young Turks, an underground movement that started in the late 1800s, all united against the rule of Sultan Abdul Hamid II. Operating in Paris, which, from me saying that, there's already a lot of red flags, they model themselves after nationalist and revolutionary groups in the West, such as Young Italy, Young France, and Young Germany. And that's also why the movement decided to name themselves Genuous Turks, the French word for Young Turks. That's also why the movement's largest organization, the Committee of Union and Progress, which was the Ottoman government that specifically ruled during World War I, got its name from the French philosopher Auguste Comte. I'm not joking here. To finally debunk Apostate Prophet's narrative, I'm just going to provide this extract from the Dutch historian Oya Umut Unger. There, the Young Turks' efforts produced the constitutional revolution of 1908 and launched the Young Turks into the Ottoman parliament and to power positions. Ottomans of all denominations marched into the streets under the banners bearing the slogans Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité in various languages and welcomed the age of freedom and democracy. If you really think that these Islamic leaders were inspired by Islam, I don't know what to tell you.
This was a very heavy payback for the aggressive history of the Ottoman Empire.
What? What aggressive history? If this was after the siege of Vienna or something, that would probably make sense. However, the Ottoman Empire was declining territorially for some 200 years prior to World War I. There's a reason why the Ottomans were known as the Sick Man of Europe. Look at any animated map of the Ottomans on YouTube and you would have known this.
The alliance with the German Empire.
This is again a gross oversimplification because the Ottomans prior to World War I were led by the Young Turks, a movement that I've already made clear were way more Western and secular minded than any other leadership in its history. Therefore, the Ottomans' reason to join World War I had little to do with Islam, and instead it was a combination of Turkish nationalism, i.e. reclaiming the Turkic lands in the Caucasus and beyond, alongside concerns that the Ottoman Empire would be carved up by the potential victors of World War I. That being said, not everyone wanted to join the war, and in fact, despite what Apostate Prophet might say to smear the Khilafah, it was Sultan Mehmed V that didn't want to join World War I. However, I wonder what happened to him.
On the pro let's not get involved at all side was Sultan Mehmed V. However, his position was largely ceremonial by this point, and so everyone ignored him.
So to summarize, joining World War I had nothing to do with the Sultan, and instead most of the decision making was done by the Committee of Union and Progress, and more specifically Enver Pasha, the Ottoman Minister of War at the time, someone who was also described as the hero of the Young Turk Revolution against Abdul Hamid II. So I just want to make that very clear. It was Enver Pasha who decided to use German warships, dressing up their German crew with feathers, and bombing several Russian ports in the Black Sea coast, and it was these actions that dragged the entire Ottoman Empire into the First World War. And the consequences of this decision, specifically by the Ottoman government, was destructive.
Enver Pasha got what he wanted. The Ottomans were now at war. For Pasha, the aim of the war was clear. A new Turkish nation would be born from the struggle and bonded by the suffering. A nation that did not look to the Arab world for guidance, but looked to itself. But while this goal was ultimately successful, Turkey would lose a quarter of her entire population in the struggle. Millions of men, women, and children, many of them starving or freezing to death. And Enver Pasha would never be the man to lead those who lived.
It's honestly shocking, but what's more disgusting is what apostate prophet decided to say next.
And war crimes and genocides that were said to have taken place.
The fact that you didn't even bother to name what war crime or genocide that you're talking about is baffling. But he's most likely talking about the Armenian genocide, a horrific event that I don't deny myself. You know why? Because Islam had nothing to do with it. As I have repeated over and over again, the Ottoman Empire in World War I was run by arguably the most nationalist government in the empire's history. The Young Turks, and specifically the CUP, were the same guys that wrote love poems about making the Adhan and Quran into Turkish, something that was later adopted by Ataturk. These were the same guys that gutted the Sheikh ul-Islam's powers, paving the way for Ataturk's secular policies, and more specifically him creating the Diyanet in 1924. And most importantly, they were the same guys that committed a genocide against an ethnic group once protected by Islam and the Dhimmi system. What I find baffling is that you, apostate prophet, not only knew that the Young Turks existed this entire time, but you even admitted that they caused the Armenian genocide. However, you didn't bother to mention their name in the video, and instead, your audience, and honestly, a lot of other people who are unfortunately naive, will take away that Islam, to varying degrees, was responsible for the Ottomans aggressively joining World War I and killing innocent people. Apostate prophet, you're disgusting.
The Turkish nationalists decisively won this war, expelled the occupying forces, drove out the Ottoman government, and went on to form a new nation. Turks are today very proud of this, and they credit their bravery and their willpower, and mostly the leadership of Ataturk. In more religious circles, Islam is praised and credited, which is ironic because the Ottoman Empire was on the losing side, and the Ottoman Empire was the leader of Islam. But whatever.
Because I've extensively debunked apostate prophet just before, and I'm running out of time, I'm just going to get to the point. If Islam really had no role during the Turkish War of Independence, why was it then that according to Professor Shukru Haniolu, ironically it was the staunch Westernist Mustafa Kemal who addressed the entire Muslim world in these words? Following the fall of the caliphate in Damascus, Cordoba, Cairo and Baghdad, the last center of the Muslim caliphate has fallen under the shadow of enemy weapons. Anatolia is a land of refuge for many Muslim communities driven out of their homelands,